Hello, folks. Tonight we're diving into the ridiculously lavish, wildly absurd, and occasionally downright gross royal bedrooms of the Middle Ages where power, lust, and zero concept of personal space collided spectacularly. So, before you get comfy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I'm doing here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a hoot to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, turn off the lights, fire up the fan for some white noise, and let's enjoy tonight's strange journey together. King John of England, aka John Lackland, and unofficially the worst guest in English history, is mostly remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to behave outrageously with most noblewomen. John ruled from 1199 to 1216, and his reign is basically a masterclass in how not to hold public office. Politically, total disaster. Personally, way worse. John didn't just steal lovers, he stole entire families. He was infamous for kidnapping noblewomen, locking them up in royal castles, and entertaining himself until they either married someone else or simply faded into oblivion. His go-to tactic for wrecking powerful families wasn't battle. Nope. It was seducing the wife, alienating the husband, then taxing the poor guy twice as much. Surprisingly effective, chroniclers of the time were so creeped out by John's antics that even medieval historians, known for glossing over witch trials and public floggings, wrote that he couldn't control his urges around women, including wives and daughters. Classic Middle Ages stuff, making Christmas dinners incredibly awkward at one point. John supposedly had 30 officially recorded mistresses, not romantic at all, more like HR nightmare material. Some nobles actually complained directly to the crown that John abused their hospitality, which is a polite way of saying he slept with everyone, including the servants and possibly the family goat. His behavior was so bad, it nearly sparked a rebellion, not over taxes or wars, but because half the male nobles were terrified to leave their wives home alone during royal visits. One noble flat out refused to meet John unless his entire family was locked up first. That's 13th century diplomacy for you. But true to royal form, John never saw the problem. He fancied himself irresistible, no proof beyond his own letters. But hey, when you're king, delusions come standard. In the end, King John left behind a chaotic kingdom, a legacy of suspicion, and probably a few unmentioned kids at court. He's the kind of king who made people invent democracy just to keep him away from their families. Not the worst king ever, but definitely the one you wouldn't trust to babysit. Charles V, the 6th King of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And yes, that nickname was well earned. Not just something slapped on at a drunken party. He started off young, promising, handsome, and competent. Then things got weird. He began forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point believed he was made of glass, insisting servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter while moving. Not exactly royal badass vibes, but definitely creative paranoia. These days, most kings who think they're fragile glass statues just avoid drama, not Charles. Somehow, he juggled a royal mistress, delusions of grandeur, and a civil war all at once. His long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, did her best to run the court, while Charles did stuff like screaming in front of mirrors and refusing to bathe because he feared water would melt him. There's no proof for this except his own letters. But hey, when you're king, delusions are just part of the job. In the end, King John left behind a messy kingdom, a legacy of suspicion, and probably some kids nobody mentioned at court. He's the kind of king who makes people invent democracy just to keep him away from their family dinners. Not the worst king in history, but definitely the one you never want babysitting your stuff. Charles V, the sixth King of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And yep, that nickname wasn't just a drunken party joke. He started his reign promising, young, handsome, and capable. Then things went sideways. He forgot who he was, attacked his own knights, and once believed he was made of glass, demanding servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter when moving around. Not exactly regal strength, but definitely top-notch. Creative paranoia nowadays. Most kings who think they're fragile glass statues just avoid trouble. Not Charles. Somehow, he balanced a royal mistress, delusions of grandeur, and a civil war all at once. The multitasker's long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to run the court while Charles did things like run around yelling at mirrors and refusing to bathe because he feared water would melt him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Champdiver, was quietly moved into the palace and introduced as his comforter, literally medieval speak for. Odette was quietly moved into the palace and introduced as his comforter, literally medieval speak for don't ask questions, just smile. Odette stuck with Charles through his craziest years. She must have had the patience of a saint or the wealth of a queen. Rumor has it she brushed his hair, listened to his ramblings over a glass of, well, glass, and helped him layer on padded clothes so he could sit safely. You need the patience of a saint or the property portfolio of a queen. They say she brushed his hair, listened to his rambling over a glass, and helped him layer up in padded clothes so he could safely sit down. Nothing screams true love like dressing your royal boo in a pillow suit. But Charles wasn't just quirky behind closed doors. He also hosted palace parties where things got seriously out of hand. At one infamous shindig called Bald Dearden, he and his pals dressed as wild men in flammable outfits, dancing around with torches. Naturally, someone dropped a flame, and some guests got roasted alive. Charles survived, but his dignity didn't. Despite all that chaos, Charles fathered 12 kids, some of whom appeared to still have their wits about them, or at least enough to function. The royal chronicles don't say if he even remembered their names, but you'd think naming a non-glass baby would be a no-brainer. Charles VI led France straight to ruin, but even more impressive, he managed to pack mental illness, royal scandals, and medieval fireworks disasters all into one tragicomic package, and somehow they still let him wear the crown. Peter, the Cruel, or Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were on his side or under his boot, or ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. His idea of romance was a weird cocktail of royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and occasional politically inconvenient murders. His early love life wasn't exactly Shakespearean. He fell for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he might have secretly married or not. The secret part is key since he was also being married off to other women for alliances, which made things awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman he married and then locked up in a castle 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life imprisoned because Peter thought Maria had better hair, or maybe he just hated Blanche's voice. Either way, that's what you call an aggressive breakup. Meanwhile, Maria became his lifelong obsession. Even after marrying other women, she was his true favorite. When she died, Peter supposedly cried for days and then retroactively declared her his lawful wife just to mess with people and maybe to justify the 4 kids she'd given him. But Peter's passion didn't stop at surprise annulments and royal kidnappings. He was infamous for falling hard, which was anything but poetic, dangerous. Really, one of his lovers, Doña Juana, tried to escape him later. Her body was found chopped into pieces, along with some political enemies, cousins, and sometimes anyone who made eye contact at the wrong time. Contemporary records say Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while chilling with a lover. Not exactly a charming psycho, more like an HBO villain with impulse control issues. But even with all that drama, the Castilian court was never boring. Rumors spread faster than wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the line between passion and hate. His idea of romance included surprise weddings, surprise divorces, and sometimes surprise stabbings. Eventually, Peter was killed by his own half-brother in a classic case of family therapy gone wrong, but his reputation as one of Europe's least romantic romantics lives on. If love was a battlefield, Peter brought siege weapons. Edward II of England ruled from 1307 to 1327 and is best remembered for 2 things: losing Scotland at Bannockburn and showing way more affection to the men he loved than to his actual queen. One of those acts was considered Europe's least romantic romantics were still around. If love was a battlefield, Peter showed up with siege gear. Edward II of England ruled from 1307 to 1327 and is remembered mainly for 2 things: losing to Scotland at Bannockburn and being way more into the guys he fancied than his actual queen. One of those romances was seen as treason, the other just a dinner table controversy. Let's start with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood buddy, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers didn't just hang out with Edward, he got promoted to big shot positions, handed estates, titles, and jewelry that honestly didn't match any of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers rocked an outfit shinier than the royalties and totally upstaged the queen. That's so, especially when your survival depends on not pissing off the nobles. Spoiler alert, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was furious. She came with big political hopes and a hefty dowry, but neither included sharing the throne with her husband's best buddy, who might as well have been her husband's boyfriend. Still, Edward was all in. When the nobles demanded peers get booted, Edward threw a tantrum, kicked him out, then brought him right back, like a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the nobles had enough and executed peers. Edward was devastated. Think a total royal meltdown, mourning clothes, public crying scenes, the full medieval soap opera. But the heartbreak didn't make him self-reflect. It just made room for a new favorite, young Hugh Despenser. Hugh made the other nobles look like minor footnotes. He wasn't just Edward's advisor. He was basically king number 2. Land, titles. Whole counties Hugh snatched them all up, the other nobles furious. Isabella had officially morphed from annoyed wife to full-on revenge queen. She teamed up with her own lover, naturally. Edward's enemies invaded England and toppled him. Edward was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and possibly killed with a red-hot iron rod. Yep, that rumor's true. No, we're not delving into the anatomy of that. Let's just say medieval revenge wasn't exactly subtle. Edward II's reign was less about ruling and more like a brutal reality show, if the Plantagenets had Netflix. This season would be banned in 3 countries. His big mistake: mixing politics with passion, ignoring everyone else, and thinking royal power made him untouchable. Turns out, anyone could touch him. Wenceslaus of Bohemia ruled at the end of the 14th century. Though ruled might be a stretch, technically, he held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia. But his real legacy was public nudity, heavy drinking, and brawling inside his own palace. If you're picturing the nice King Wenceslaus from the Christmas Carol, nope, that was his ancestor. This Wenceslaus was no saint. He started promisingly, celebrated as a smart, multilingual teen with potential, but somewhere along the way, he decided royal bartending was more useful than treasury duties and ruled from the bottom of his cup. Wenceslaus was famous for throwing multi-day drunken parties where policy decisions happened between rounds of mead and foul-mouthed insults. His advisors started carrying water bottles not to drink, but to survive negotiations. Court debates often ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel with a breadstick. He also had a charming habit of sprinting through the castle, sometimes mid-meeting. One chronicle records Wenceslaus issuing royal edicts completely naked except for a sword belt. His excuse clothes were for cowards. Hard to argue with that logic when the guy's wearing a crown, carrying a big sword, and no pants. Romantically, he favored waitresses, chambermaids, and sometimes noble wives, though he seemed more interested in their beer tips than their feelings. His love life at court was basically job interviews. One noble accused him of hitting on his sister. Wenceslaus just shrugged and bought him a drink. Treasurer's nightmare, and started his reign from the bottom of the barrel. Wenceslaus was famous for throwing multi-day drunken parties where policy decisions happened between rounds of mead and some seriously inappropriate cursing. His advisors started bringing water bottles not to drink, but to survive the talks. Court debates usually ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel with a baguette. He also had the charming habit of sprinting through the castle, sometimes smack in the middle of meetings. 1 Chronicle records Wenceslaus issuing royal decrees completely naked, except for a sword belt. His excuse: clothes are for cowards. Hard to argue with that logic when the crown wearer's packing a big sword and no pants. On the romance front, he liked waitresses, maids, and sometimes noble wives. Though he cared more about their beer tips than their feelings. His love life at court, nothing to be embarrassed about, basically. It was just a bunch of job interviews. A noble accused him of hitting on his sister. Wenceslaus just shrugged and bought him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of his royal vodka antics and politely dethroned him, aka, "You're fired." But let's pretend it's political. Even his own brother called him useless, pantsless, and frequently knocked out cold. Yet somehow, Wenceslaus kept ruling. He's useless, pantsless, and frequently unconscious. Yet Wenceslaus still ruled Bohemia for decades. People tolerated him like that annoying uncle at a wedding side-eyeing, awkwardly rearranging seats and drowning it all in booze. Awkward seating and plenty of booze. In the end, he left behind a shaky kingdom and a wine cellar flooded to the brim, and a royal legacy best summed up as ruling like every day was his last drunken bender. Henry VIII of England is basically what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked hormones. He reigned from 1509 to 1547, spending most of that time marrying, divorcing, or throwing tantrums at the Pope for not backing his questionable dating choices. You've probably heard the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, but that's just the tip of Henry's horror romantic comedy series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was mad at him for not producing a male heir. Of course, his solution wasn't self-reflection. Nope. He annulled, excommunicated, and even founded a whole new church just to go on a dating spree. He created the Church of England just to date someone else. Not devotion, just petty drama with a side of theology. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry wrote her love letters dripping with passion, obsession, and some truly terrible poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, future badass queen, and one of England's greatest rulers, but no son. That led to charges of adultery, witchcraft, and maybe a little courtroom drama. She got her head chopped off. Henry moved on, showing the emotional range of a baked potato. Jane Seymour came next, gave birth to a male heir, Edward, then tragically died from childbirth complications. Henry was oh so sad, meaning he waited a respectful 11 days before scouting for wife number 4. Anne of Cleves arrived, picked based on a flattering portrait. Henry said she looked like a Flemish mare. That marriage lasted 6 months and ended with what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a polite Yelp review. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was way younger and far less discreet. She got executed for adultery. But honestly, can you blame her? Marrying Henry back then meant dealing with gout, paranoia, and a dude who could barely walk but still insisted he was a gift to women everywhere. Finally, Catherine Parr, wife number 6, wisely outlived him thanks to literacy, patience, and major skill dodging accusations. When Henry died, he left England broke, half its livestock gone, and the court a soap opera where heads rolled more often than wedding rings. In short, Henry VIII loved hard, ruled harder, and left behind enough legendary drama to keep musicals in business forever. Francis I of France, king from 1515 to 1547, was the Renaissance man incarnate, educated, charming, sophisticated, but utterly hopeless with buttons. Credit where it's due, he was a fantastic arts patron. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built stunning palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while artists were painting and poets were writing, Francis was busy charming every heartbeat and title he could find. His court was famous or infamous for opulence, but also for being basically a government-sponsored dating app. He hired gentlewomen to serve in the bedchambers, a term that should mean maids, but actually meant a short list of romantic conquests. Entire political alliances fell apart because Francis accidentally slept with an ambassador's wife. And this wasn't some subtle affair. Renaissance man educated, charming, refined, but utterly clueless about buttoning his pants. Credit where it's due. He was a fantastic patron of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built lavish palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while painters were painting and poets were penning verses, Francis was busy seducing anything with a heartbeat and a title. His court was famous, or maybe infamous, for its luxury, but also for being a government-sponsored dating app. He hired gentlewomen to serve in the bedroom, a term that should mean maids, but actually meant a short list of romantic conquests. The entire political alliance fell apart because Francis accidentally slept with the ambassador's wife. And this wasn't some discreet, hush-hush affair. Francis made a big deal out of it. He openly told foreign officials that French kings were expected to be. Amazing lovers sounds noble until you realize this came from a guy who treated both treaties and mistresses as temporary. His most famous affair was with Françoise de Foix, a noblewoman who later became his official mistress. Françoise de Foix, a witty, educated woman, probably the only lady who could roast him in public and live to tell the tale. She was eventually replaced by Anne de Pisseleu d'Ailly, a woman with a name straight out of a medieval joke and political influence, only rivaled by a woman with a name straight out of a medieval joke and political clout, only matched by her uncanny ability to dodge rivals. Even enemies couldn't help but notice. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once described Francis as more dangerous in bed than on the battlefield. Yep, that was meant to be an insult. Maybe Francis took it as a compliment, somehow. Between all the drama, parties, and what you could only call diplomatic flirtation, Francis still managed to rule effectively. Sure, his wars cost a fortune, and his taste for women was even pricier. But this guy never ran out of enthusiasm. His reign was dripping with silk, scandal, and old cologne. Francis, I wasn't just a king. He was France's most entertaining historical headache, and, honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Alfonso, the 11th King of Castile, ruled from 1311 to 1350. Besides running the kingdom, he had a huge hobby blatantly ignoring his wife in the most extravagant way possible. His poor but politically savvy wife was Maria of Portugal, noble, well-connected, but unfortunately, Leonor de Guzman wasn't the woman Alfonso actually cared about. Leonor was a sharp-minded Castilian noblewoman with 11 kids and enough influence to practically run the court herself. And unlike Maria, she didn't need a crown to feel important. All she needed was Alfonso's shameless obsession. Nowadays, most kings have mistresses. Alfonso took it to queen-level darkness. He built palaces for Leonor, handed her lands, and paraded her around everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left solo at royal events, like an unwanted wallflower, while Alfonso shot side-eye glances at his girlfriend strolling through the halls, who didn't even bother pretending to be discreet, worse or better, depending on how much medieval soap opera you can stomach. Leonor wasn't just a mistress, she was a political player, negotiating treaties, earning respect, and popping out heirs like it was her full-time job, which, honestly, it basically was. Alfonso even refused to fake caring about Maria. In fact, he only spent time with her once, and that was purely for diplomatic reasons. Then he retreated to Leonor's estates, like a man allergic to marital duty. That didn't exactly make Maria's dad, who was actually the King of Portugal, happy. At some point, international relations got so tense that war almost broke out. Imagine your in-laws so mad at your mistress, they're seriously considering military payback. But Alfonso didn't care. He kept parading Leonor around court like a royal trophy, and probably would have kept going forever if the Black Death hadn't taken him out in 1350. Yep, it took an actual pandemic to kill his love affair after Alfonso died. Queen Maria finally got her moment. She ordered Leonor imprisoned and executed in a move historians call revenge, and most of us would just call totally fair. Alfonso's reign might be remembered for military victories, but let's be real. His real legacy was being one of medieval history's most publicly roasted kings, Philip IV of France, aka Philip the Fair, not for his personality. Mind you, ruled from 1285 to 1314. His nickname came from his handsome looks, which sadly didn't come with a good personality. Outwardly, Philip was pious, serious, and all about moral reform. Inside, he ran his kingdom like a high-stakes reality TV show full of betrayals, secret trials, and double standards galore, especially in the bedroom. His most infamous scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair, a medieval sex scandal so tangled it could have been scripted by HBO. It all kicked off when Philip's daughter. This medieval sex scandal was so tangled it could have been an HBO miniseries. It all kicked off when Philip's daughter, Isabella, yes, the same one who later overthrew England's Edward II, noticed her sister-in-law getting way too friendly with some knights, friendly in a suspicious way, like exchanging gifts and secret meetings in towers. Isabella tattled to Philip, who launched a royal investigation that was as subtle as a sledgehammer. 2 princesses married to Philip's sons got convicted, adultery, and publicly locked up for years. Their heads were shaved, titles stripped, and their reputations completely destroyed. 2 knights got dragged into it, tortured, flayed, and executed in the town square because nothing screams moral leadership like turning a family drama into a medieval horror show. And here's the juicy part. While Philip was dishing out brutal punishments like candy, rumors flew that he kept a harem of lovers in private rooms under the eaves. Some whispered he maintained a secret group of young women who entertained visiting dignitaries for diplomatic reasons. But unlike his daughters-in-law, no one ever questioned the king's private life, because when you're the guy writing the rules, sin becomes strategy. Philip also had a special knack for using religion when it suited him. He prosecuted the Knights Templar for heresy, but everyone knew it was really about money. It's basically medieval justice calling out bankers for crimes against God. Yep, Philip might look like a poster boy for piety and honor, but behind that chiseled jawline and royal glare was a deeply hypocritical man who knew all the castle's secret passageways. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, was the kind of guy who collected crowns like others collect wine glasses, which he also did, enthusiastically, ruling from the late 14th to mid-15th century. Sigismund was smart, multilingual, and politically savvy. He also had a private life so scandalous it'd make a tavern keeper blush. First, Sigismund married Mary, Queen of Hungary, a powerful woman, but their marriage was mostly a polite formality. He preferred relationships with fewer rules, more often, and ideally, no awkward conversations afterward. His romantic ventures included noblewomen, ladies-in-waiting, and at least one Italian opera singer way before opera was even a thing, which shows his flair for innovation. Court officials often lost track of his lovers, not because there were too many, but because they changed so frequently. Some historians say they only ever started numbering them. At court, his mistresses had their own rooms, servants, and in one case, even a private chapel, which could be either romantic or wildly inappropriate, depending on your feelings about praying next to someone's lover. Sigismund also loved to play dress-up, especially dressing as a commoner to sneak into town, sometimes for spying, sometimes to flirt with local women, disguised as a tall merchant. Apparently, no one found this suspicious, even though he was the only merchant rolling with a royal badge-wearing entourage. Still, this man ruled for decades, launched crusades, chaired the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while keeping a love life that would make even Casanova jealous. An ambassador once wrote that Sigismund treated all women like equals, especially in private, which sounds progressive, but also suspiciously like breaking HR rules. But despite his extracurriculars, Sigismund remained wildly popular, mostly because he always looked majestic in public while secretly running Europe's most chaotic love life. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a Renaissance man strategist, politician, and scandal magnate. And somehow, he always got away with it. Louis XV of France, nicknamed Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. Imagine praying next to someone else's lover. Sigismund was into disguise, especially dressing as a commoner and sneaking into town, sometimes for spying, sometimes to hit on local ladies, pretending to be a tall merchant. Somehow, no one found this suspicious, even though he was the only merchant with a royal entourage of badge-wearing servants. Still, this man ruled for decades, launched crusades, chaired the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while keeping a love life that would make even Casanova jealous. An ambassador once wrote that Sigismund greeted all women as equals, especially in private, which sounds progressive, but also a bit like a serious HR violation, despite his extracurriculars. Sigismund remained hugely respected, mainly because he looked regal in public while secretly managing Europe's messiest love life. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a Renaissance man strategist, politician, and scandal magnate, and somehow, he always got away with it. Louis XV of France, nicknamed Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. When we say ruled, we mostly mean he threw endless royal parties after marriage, where ruling was optional, but silk sheets were a must. He was just an emperor, a Renaissance man part strategist, part politician, part walking scandal, and somehow, he always got away with it. Louis XV of France, aka Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. By ruled, we mostly mean he threw endless royal parties after getting hitched governing was optional, but silk sheets were a must. He started his career full of promise young, handsome, and ready to carry on his grandpa Louis XIV's legacy. But by his 20s, Louis decided national policy could totally wait. After all, he had a long list of ladies waiting for his attention. Let's talk about Parc aux Cerfs, a quiet little spot near Versailles where Louis held what you might call private auditions. The girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, discreetly rotated like seasonal products. So many mistresses that palace guards literally used a filing system. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, wasn't just a pretty face, basically. She quietly ran France, but when she lost interest in the physical side of things, Louis was like, cool, no worries. And he built a second harem. The logic: keep Pompadour for brains and banter. Keep the Parc aux Cerfs system for everything else. Chaos with order. Each girl got gifts, titles, and sometimes even their own place after their contract ended. The most unofficial but strangely efficient internship program in France. Meanwhile, Queen Marie Leszczyńska just hung around, mostly ignored, after she stopped having kids. Louis treated her like antique furniture, too expensive to toss out, but no longer fitting the room. The court scandals became so normal that nobles stopped asking if the king had mistresses. They asked, how many this week? Even foreign ambassadors gossiped in letters, about the staff turnover rate at Versailles. This wasn't a monarchy. It was a brothel with better uniforms. Ironically, Louis really thought he was a restrained guy between lavish parties, secret pregnancies, and awkward silences with his wife. His reign, while not a disaster, laid the groundwork for his grandson, Louis XVI, who lost his head maybe because Grandpa spent too much time thinking with the wrong crown on in the end. Louis XV left France drowning in debt, a disillusioned court, and a royal reputation best summed up as loved by women, hated by accountants. Christian VII of Denmark ruled from 1766 to 1808, although ruled might be a bit of a stretch, more like barely surviving while others ran the country. See, Christian had some issues. He suffered from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, and had zero interest in being king, unless it involved chasing servants around with cutlery, which he found hilarious. This made him more of a royal mascot than an actual ruler. By then, Christian was married to Caroline Matilda of England, a young, smart woman hoping for a normal marriage. What she got was a husband who masturbated in public, talked to his own hand, and vanished into state dinner parties to ride imaginary horses down palace hallways. No one's quite sure what gave out first, her patience or his grip on reality. Enter Jan Friedrich Struensee, the king's doctor, smart, ambitious, and power-hungry. Struensee quickly became the real ruler of Denmark, and awkwardly, the queen's lover. Yep, Caroline Matilda jumped into this soap opera and started an affair with her husband's doctor. Meanwhile, the king was oblivious or just didn't care. Struensee wrote the laws, signed decrees, kept Christian busy with puppet shows, swordplay games, and gently steered the dude away from sharp objects. This might be the only royal love triangle in history where one corner just hummed vaguely alone in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a child together, officially the king's, but almost certainly not biologically. For a while, these two ran Denmark like a wildly progressive and somewhat scandalous research project. But royal palaces are rarely relaxing spots. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law found out and staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed in a pretty gruesome way. While Caroline was exiled with her reputation ruined, Christian went back to being a supervised figurehead, spending probably the only love triangle in history where one corner vaguely hums to itself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a kid together legally, maybe the king's, but definitely not dad's in reality. For a while, these two ran Denmark like a super progressive and slightly scandalous research club, but the royal palace was rarely chill. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law caught wind of the affair and staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed in a pretty gruesome way, while Caroline was exiled with her reputation completely trashed. As for Christian, he went back to being a lightly supervised king, spending the rest of his reign in a well-protected silence. His reign is remembered not for achievements, but for the absurdity of it all: a king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best and a doctor who tried way too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. A doctor pushed himself too hard. History calls it the constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from exile with a clear agenda: party hard, preferably with as many mistresses as possible. Spoiler alert, mission accomplished. Party hard, preferably with as many mistresses as humanly possible. Spoiler alert, mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees, and living in continental poverty, Charles returned to England as king and quickly decided the country needed less Puritanism and way more naked dancing. Parliament reluctantly agreed, nicknamed the Merry Monarch. Charles had dozens of official mistresses, and that's just the ones we know about. His most famous lover was Nell Gwynn, a sharp-tongued actress who proudly called herself a Protestant whore, just to stand out from the other mistresses. Honestly, that's some iconic branding. Then there was Barbara Palmer, the Countess of Castlemaine, not just a mistress, but a major palace player. She openly lived in royal apartments and had several kids with Charles, all of whom got titles and land because nepotism is way more fun when it's official. Charles didn't even bother to pretend he was discreet. He brought his mistresses to court events. He paid their pensions from the government. He even built a corridor at Whitehall so they could sneak into his bedroom without disturbing the ambassadors. Effective. Right, the guy's name was Charles. Queen Catherine of Braganza, his long-suffering wife, took all this with calm dignity, or maybe just turned herself into a vase. She didn't have kids, and Charles reportedly said, "She can't have children, but she never caused me trouble," which is both a compliment and a warning sign. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate kids and acknowledged most of them, giving them noble titles and throwing lavish birthday parties. Meanwhile, the legitimate line stayed childless, as if karma had a twisted sense of humor despite the scandals. Charles was widely loved. He reopened theaters, legalized entertainment, and restored the monarchy with more flair, wigs, and eyeliner than his actresses. People forgave him everything, mostly because he made monarchy look like a non-stop party. When he died, his last words were, "Don't let poor Nellie starve. Don't bless England. Don't make my brother rule wisely. Just take care of the mistress." And, ladies and gents, Charles II ruled like he was hosting the royal bachelor party finale. Eric XIV, King of Sweden, ruled from 1560 to 1568, a short reign, but long enough to leave a legacy of paranoia, poetry, and disastrously bad dating choices. At first, Eric seemed promising, tall, handsome, into astronomy and the arts, the kind of king who could write you a love poem and then explain planetary orbits over dinner. He was also obsessed with astrology and rarely made decisions without checking the stars first. Unfortunately, the stars never told him to chill out. Eric had feelings for noble women, but not the whispering in the garden kind. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth I of England multiple times, and she said no. politely at first, then firmly, then stopped responding altogether. Eric didn't get the hint and even sent her a portrait as a gift. Basically, the 16th century equivalent of sending a shirtless selfie and a marriage contract in someone's DMs. After Elizabeth ignored him, Eric lowered his standards, not his enthusiasm. He fell for Karen Munn's daughter, commoner and a jailer's kid. This enraged the nobility and pushed Eric deeper into madness. He married her, crowned her queen, then spent the next year in a mental breakdown, imprisoning nobles and stabbing anyone who looked at her funny. His most infamous moment, the Stour, murders a dinner party that ended with Eric personally knifing a nobleman while screaming things that made his advisors seriously question their life choices. So, did astrology really fry this guy's brain by now? He's hearing voices, hiding from invisible enemies, and occasionally going undercover to spy on his own council. The nobles staged a coup royal speak for locking him up in a castle and handing the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his days in prison, writing weird love poems to Karen, complaining about conspiracies, and probably regretting stabbing that dude at dinner. Sweden learned a few things from Eric's reign. Always check if dinner guests are packing knives. Steer clear of kings who write their own horoscopes. And maybe don't give the crown to a guy who insists the moon is whispering about betrayal. Ferdinand I of Naples, aka Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled in the mid-15th century and somehow combined charm, brutality, and taste in a way that made everyone cancel dinner plans immediately. On the surface, Ferdinand was a learned and efficient ruler. He stabilized the kingdom, balanced the budget, and crushed rebellions faster than you can say bad idea. But his leadership style leaned more friendly dictator with a side of psychological warfare. Case in point, his approach to enemies. Most kings exiled traitors. Some locked them up. Ferdinand preferred stuffing them. Yep, taxidermy for people after executing rebellious nobles. He embalmed their bodies and displayed them in a private museum beneath his castle. It was called the Black Room, and he gave tours to foreign officials, ambassadors, and even potential traitors. Nothing says I'm well behaved like showing off your collection of political screw-ups. Word is, he liked to label each corpse with their name, crime, and facial expression. Some looked like they were mid-scream. Others held little signs. One guest fainted. Ferdinand thought it was hilarious. If TripAdvisor existed back then, the reviews would be 5 stars, terrifying, and definitely not a place to return to without a dare. When he wasn't running Europe's creepiest gallery, Ferdinand had a reputation as a sketchy romantic. He had tons of illegitimate kids, many suddenly popping up with titles and land. His official queen was just one of many ladies. And rumor had it, Ferdinand treated marriage more like a suggestion than a rule. His lovers ranged from noblewomen to peasants. The only thing they had in common was Ferdinand's complete disregard for discretion. Royal dinners sometimes doubled as flirt-off competitions. An ambassador noted Ferdinand never ate without sampling plenty of dishes, political and otherwise. Yet, despite all this madness, Ferdinand was still beloved. People admired his strength. Nobles feared him. and enemies lost all enthusiasm for rebellion after seeing the Black Room. He ruled for decades, died in his sickbed, and passed the kingdom to his rightful heirs. Ferdinand's legacy: a stable realm, a terrifying basement, and a clear lesson that some kings build alliances while others collect warning signs in glass cases. That was the year 1199. The dust from the First Crusade still clung to Jerusalem's crumbled stones. Christian pilgrims flooded the Holy Land, believing the sacred city was now safe. But outside the walls, chaos reigned. Bandits lurked on the roads. Muslim warriors attacked caravans, and travelers were slaughtered or sold into slavery. The dream of Christian safety in the East was collapsing. That's when a knight named Hugh Dayon and 8 companions took an oath not to a king, not to a lord. Still beloved, people admired his strength, nobles feared him, and enemies lost interest in rebellion the moment they saw the Black Room. He ruled for decades, died in bed, and passed the kingdom on to his rightful heirs. Ferdinand's legacy: a stable kingdom, a terrifying basement, and the firm understanding that some kings build alliances while others collect warning signs in display cases. That was the year 1199. The dust from the First Crusade still clung to Jerusalem's crumbled stones. Christian pilgrims flocked to the Holy Land, thinking the sacred city was safe now. But outside the walls, chaos reigned. Bandits lurked on the roads. Muslim warriors attacked caravans. Travelers were slaughtered or sold into slavery. The dream of Christian safety in the East was falling apart. That's when a knight named Hugh Dayon and 8 companions swore allegiance not to a king or lord, but to God himself. They pledged to protect Christian pilgrims with their lives, not just soldiers, but monks too. They vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no gold, no land, just horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Sounds fancy, but that last part is key because King Baldwin II gave them quarters at the Temple Mount, where the ruins of Solomon's temple stood from this holy ground. They took their name the Knights Templar. For 9 years, they were a small, unofficial, underfunded group facing deadly commitments. They lived like beggars, borrowing armor, sharing war horses, and training like maniacs. But they were very disciplined, devout, dangerous, and their reputation started to spread. Soon enough, their weird mix of monks and warriors caught the eye of one of the most powerful men in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard wasn't your average priest. He was the spiritual rock star of his day. When he spoke, popes listened, and he saw something holy in these guys. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped draft the official Templar rulebook of us, hardcore monastic code mixed with military purpose. He praised them as the new knightly elite, a holy class fighting not for glory, but for God. With Bernard's blessing and the Pope's approval, the Knights Templar were no longer just a desperate little club. They became a church-approved order. Donations poured in, young nobles gave up cushy lives to join their ranks. From Jerusalem, the Templars rose holy, hungry, and officially unstoppable. But little did they know, their greatest blessing, the Pope's independence, would one day mark their doom. With papal recognition and their white robes embroidered with blood-red crosses, the Knights Templar were no longer just sword-wielding monks. They were Christendom's shock troops, the Crusader states in the Levant, fragile Christian outposts surrounded by Islamic resistance, were constantly under threat, and the Knights Templar were the firewall holding back the tide. Their rules were brutal, but clear: never retreat. Unless outnumbered 3-1, no ransom, no mercy, no fear. They trained daily, fought with fanatic discipline, and believed dying in battle was the highest honor. While most knights fought for loot and pride, the Templars fought with a terrifying sense of righteousness. They were God's wrath on horseback. During the Second Crusade, they proved their worth. While lords bickered and failed to capture Damascus, the Knights Templar kept their discipline and crushed the enemy. Their skirmishes and open battles became legendary. It wasn't just their skill, it was their reputation. Islamic commanders started calling them, in battle reports, the demons in white cloaks with red crosses. They didn't just fight, they fortified their power across the Holy Land. The Templars built a network of ironclad castles and fortresses. Saftosa and the mighty fortress of Bagrash weren't pretty estates. Templar castles were military fortresses with thick walls, trap gates, and water systems designed to withstand sieges that lasted years. When armies fled, the knights stayed to buy time or die trying, but their loyalty wasn't to kings or emperors, it was to the Pope alone. That made them a rare breed, both admired and feared by rulers. No king could command them, no baron could bribe them, only a grand master, elected from within, could order them to fight or retreat. They had supreme discipline, even if it meant bleeding for the cross. And they weren't just recruiting soldiers, they were building a legend. Their rituals were secret, their privileges absolute, their discipline ironclad. To some, they were saints, to others, a bad omen, but their fame only grew. They had transformed from 9 scruffy knights into an elite order spanning continents. But with fame came whispers, and with whispers came jealousy. The sword of God had grown sharp, but one day that blade would turn on them. Whispers were all jealousy. The sword of God had grown sharp, but one day it would turn on them. They started out with borrowed armor and a vow to live in poverty, but within a century, the Order of the Temple Knights wasn't just fighters. They were the most trusted financial institution in the world. And no, they didn't plan to become bankers. War made them rich, faith made them trustworthy, and necessity made them clever. It all began with donations. Nobles wanting to support the Holy Land gave them land, gold, livestock, even entire villages. The Templars didn't just hoard all that wealth. They managed it carefully and strategically. They built districts all over Europe. The farms ran like efficient businesses. Everything was accounted for: grain, livestock, taxes, tithes. A monk in England could send money to support a battle in Jerusalem within weeks. That kind of reach was unheard of. Then came the banking system. A noble traveling to the Holy Land no longer had to risk carrying a chest full of coins. He could deposit money with a Templar in Paris, get a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount at a branch in England. This was one of the earliest forms of international banking. The Templars charged a modest fee, kept meticulous records, and never went bankrupt. They became the medieval world's Swiss bank, centuries before Switzerland existed. Their clients were kings, queens, bishops, and merchants. They guarded French royal jewels, managed papal finances, funded crusades, and ransomed prisoners. In some cases, they even lent money to the very kings who would later try to destroy them. The Templars didn't flaunt their wealth. No silk or gold for them. Their churches were plain, their clothes simple, but underneath that austerity was an empire of ledgers, treasuries, and armored carriages. An invisible hand influenced almost every economy in Europe, yet they refused to call themselves bankers. They were monks. They insisted everything they did was in service to God, but the more gold they moved, the more enemies they made. The church turned a blind eye. After all, the Templars answered only to the Pope, but kings grew nervous. They owed the Templars huge sums and couldn't control them. What started as protection for pilgrims had turned into something stranger. They were warriors without a battlefield, monks without a monastery, bankers without a kingdom, and as their treasury grew heavier, so did the weight of suspicion, power unchecked. That's when the kings began sharpening their knives with all their power. The Templars were fighting a losing battle. The Crusader states, Ultramar, were castles made of sand, constantly battered by the rising tide of Islam. Leading that tide was Saladin, the brilliant ruler of Egypt and Syria. Unlike the disorganized, petty Crusader lords, Saladin was a united force, and he had one goal: reclaim Jerusalem. In 1187, that goal became reality at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars fought to their last breath, but they were crushed, overwhelmed, outnumbered, and trapped in blazing heat. The Christian army was wiped out. Saladin captured hundreds of knights. Most were ransomed, but when it came to the Templars, he showed no mercy. He executed nearly all of them. To Saladin, keeping them alive was too dangerous. Losing Jerusalem wasn't just a military hit. It was a spiritual crisis. The city they vowed to protect was gone. The sacred temple had returned to Muslim hands, and with it, the original purpose of the Templars began to crumble, but they regrouped. The Third Crusade brought reinforcements and Richard the Lionheart, who greatly respected and trusted the Templars in battle. But even he couldn't retake Jerusalem. Over the next century, the Crusader states faded like dying embers. One city after another fell: Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. The Templars' last stronghold at the Holy Land was lost. They retreated to Cyprus, where they set up a new HQ and tried to stay relevant. But something changed. They were still warriors, sure, but there was no Holy Land left to protect. So what exactly were they fighting for now? Their castles were empty, their legends slowly faded away, discipline, their trademark, started to unravel. Meanwhile, rival orders like the Hospitallers began gaining the upper hand. Rumors of pride, corruption, and arrogance followed the Templars all over Europe. Some whispered they'd grown way too rich and secretive. Others claimed they were hoarding dangerous relics. The East had shaped, forged, and broken them, and now, without it, the Templars were just ashes. They still had wealth, connections, and power's allure, but they'd lost what made them essential: a sword without a war, a brotherhood without a crusade, and in that void, mighty enemies were watching. By the early 14th century, the Templars were still rich, feared, and powerful, but for the first time in history, they were also irrelevant. The Holy Land was gone. No more crusades. They'd become a military order without a war, a religious group without a clear mission, financial powerhouse that answered to no king, and that made them a target. No one eyed them with more suspicion and greed than King Philip IV of France, aka Philip the Fair. He wasn't called the Fair because he was just or nice. He was drowning, in debt, bankrupt from wars with England and Flanders, and the Templars were his lenders. He'd borrowed big from them to fund his army and keep his throne. But Philip hated owing money, especially to people he couldn't control. Worse, the Templars were politically independent. They answered only to the Pope, not the crown. They owned land in France but paid no taxes to the king. They had their own fortresses, courts, and armies. To Philip, they were a dangerous state within his state, untouchable, immovable, and filthy rich. So he started scheming. Philip's propaganda machine kicked into gear. Rumors spread that the Templars worshipped idols, spat on the cross, and performed obscene initiation rituals. No proof, just whispers. But in an age of superstition, whispers were enough. He leaned on his puppet pope, Clement V, pressuring him to investigate. Clement hesitated, but Philip wasn't waiting. In secret, Philip orchestrated one of the most tightly coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. He picked the date, gathered troops, prepped the torturers. And on a cold October Friday in 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. Across France, Templars were arrested, questioned, jailed, and tortured. Confessions were forced. Some broke down in hours. Others held out until their bodies gave up. It was betrayal disguised as holy justice, and it worked. The public, once loyal, started to turn. The Pope, pressured and humiliated, found himself cornered. The tide had turned, not in battle, but in politics, and the warrior monks, once charging into enemy ranks, were now chained in dungeons, accused of crimes no sword could defend against. October 13th, 1307. The day forever cursed, Friday the 13th in Western imagination. At dawn, armed men moved silently across every corner of France. Their orders: arrest every Templar you can find. No warnings, no resistance allowed. The king's justice had arrived. With swords drawn and sealed arrest warrants, thousands of knights were dragged from their beds, some in full armor, others praying. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was caught in Paris, betrayed by the very kingdom he once protected. Across cities and countryside, armed men moved in silence, their orders clear as day: arrest every Templar knight you can find. No warnings, no resistance allowed. The king's brand of justice had arrived. With swords drawn and arrest warrants sealed, thousands of knights were yanked out of bed, some in full armor, others mid-prayer. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was caught in Paris, betrayed by the very kingdom he once defended with his life. Across towns and countryside, Templar districts were raided, their treasuries broken into, libraries seized. The charges: utter madness, heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, gay sex, satanic rituals. Most of it was pure Philip's lawyer's fiction, but in an age of fear and religious fanaticism, truth didn't matter. It just had to be believable, and the Templars were crushed by fire and iron. Torture chambers blazed across France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, skinned until their confessions dripped like blood. They confessed to whatever their torturers wanted, denying Christ, worshiping a severed head named Baphomet, kissing each other in secret ceremonies, in excruciating pain. Even Grand Master Jacques de Molay confessed, then recanted. It was a twisted theater of so-called justice, a king wiping out his debtors by accusing them of horrors no one dared defend. Pope Clement V was humiliated. He tried to mediate, but Philip moved too fast and too ruthlessly, cornered. Clement ordered his own investigation. Other countries like England and Spain hesitated. In many cases, charges were dropped or Templar knights were released. But in France, the machine of condemnation kept grinding. Philip seized their assets, even though most of it had mysteriously vanished. Some whispered the Templars spirited their treasure away. Others insisted it was never found. Some claimed the real treasure wasn't gold, but knowledge, secrets, relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. The Templar Order was no longer a brotherhood. They became fugitives, prisoners, walking dead. The king struck not with armies, but with ink, fire, and lies, and the world would never see the Red Cross the same way again. By 1312, the end was inevitable. The Templars, once the most powerful military order in Christendom, were reduced to weakened inmates. Their confessions, twisted by torture, were used to justify what came next. And what came next was dissolution. Under intense pressure from King Philip IV, Pope Clement V officially disbanded the Templar Order at the Council of Vienne in March 1312, stripping them of title, property, and identity. Officially, the Knights Templar ceased to exist. The Holy See claimed it was an act of mercy, not punishment, a necessary step to prevent further scandal. In reality, it was a political execution disguised as clerical justice. The order's assets were handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, but not everything made the transfer. Most of the wealth, treasure, ledgers, and supposed Templar relics vanished. Some say it was hidden. Others believe Philip's treasury quietly pocketed it all. Either way, the vast Templar financial empire went up in smoke, leaving only questions behind. But the final act wasn't over. In 1314, Grand Master Jacques de Molay, after 7 long years in prison, was led to the execution stake in Paris. He was to be burned alive with Geoffroy de Charnay, another high-ranking Templar. Both had retracted their confessions, insisting to the last that the charges were false and that they would be burned for their defiance. They were tied to a wooden stake on a tiny island in the Seine as flames. All that's left are questions, but the final act hasn't played out yet. In 1314, Grand Master Jacques de Molay, after 7 long years in prison, was dragged to the execution stake in Paris. He was to be executed alongside Geoffroy de Charnay, another big shot in the Knights Templar. Both had retracted their confessions, stubbornly insisting until the last second that their order was innocent and that they'd be burned alive for their defiance. They were tied to wooden stakes on a tiny island in the Seine as the flames roared up. Molay shouted through the smoke, begging God to judge those who sentenced him. Legend says he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement, declaring they'd both die within a year, and guess what they did? Clement kicked the bucket from illness just a month later. Philip followed suit at the end of the year. Suddenly and without warning, some folks whispered it was divine justice. Others called it a crazy coincidence. But the legend stuck. The Knights Templar had died cursing their killers, and heaven apparently listened along with that. The last true voice of the Knights Templar was snuffed out in flames. Their story didn't end with a battle. It ended with betrayal, torture, and fire, yet even wiped off the map. Their legend was just getting started. The execution fire was dead out, but their legendary fire was burning hotter than ever as the order collapsed. Their castles were seized and leaders executed. It seemed their story was over, but then something weird happened. Instead of fading into oblivion, the Knights Templar morphed from disgraced monks into eternal symbols of mystery and power. The secrecy that once protected them became the source of wild rumors. What happened to their treasure, their scrolls, relics, and sacred knowledge? Where did it go? Some believe the knights snatched the Holy Grail before getting caught. Others whisper they hid the Ark of the Covenant or guarded Jesus' own descendants. No proof, just darkness. But in medieval times, darkness was pretty much enough. Then came the idea that the Templars survived underground. Though officially disbanded, many former Templars quietly blended into society. Some joined other monastic orders. Some became mercenaries. But legend says others stayed underground, running secret societies, guarding rituals and relics in silence, waiting for their moment. Centuries later, those stories turned legendary. People either credited or blamed the Templars for everything from building Gothic cathedrals to founding the Freemasons. Conspiracy theories popped up like mushrooms. The Knights controlled banks, thrones, and revolutions, that they were never really defeated, just hidden. That behind every major historic event was a hidden hand in a white cloak steering the outcome. Pop culture didn't help. The Templars show up in books, games, movies sometimes, heroes, sometimes villains. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code made them guardians of the sacred bloodline. Assassin's Creed turned them into a global organization controlling civilization. Every retelling twists the truth, but feeds the fascination. In reality, the knights were flesh and blood warriors, brave, flawed, definitely religious fighters, trying to blend monastic vows with the violence of war and paying the price. But myths endure because they offer what history often doesn't answers, meaning mystery. The real knights died on the gallows and in dungeons, but the mythic knights still live in imagination, immortal, armored, and cloaked in secrets. And in that sense, Philip the Fair lost. He destroyed their bodies, but their legend is untouchable. Over 7 centuries have passed since the last Grand Master of the Knights was burned alive on the Seine's banks, but the Red Cross lives on in literature, in architecture, in symbols carved on ancient stones and whispered through conspiracy theories. The knights may be gone, but their legacy remains. They weren't just warriors, they were innovators. In an age when kings ruled by divine right and banking was a sin, the Templars built a financial, logistical, and diplomatic network across Europe. Their letters of credit foreshadowed the modern Czech. Their command units operated like regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were the original blueprint for globalization, ruled with divine authority, and since banking was considered sinful, the Knights Templar built a financial network, logistics, and diplomacy all across Europe. Their letters of credit were basically the great-grandparents of modern Czechs. Their command units operated like regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were the original blueprint for globalization, built not with stock markets, but with swords and sacred oaths. Militarily, they redefined what it meant to be a knight. Before the Templars, chivalry was a personal, flexible code that was often ignored. The Templars turned it into an organization, a discipline enforced with brutal consistency. They weren't lone champions fighting for glory. They were trained units, like modern special forces, ready to die for an abstract ideal, and they did, often quietly, sometimes pointlessly, but never without impact. Culturally, they flipped Western views on religion and war. The idea of warrior monks challenged the notion that holiness and violence don't mix. They proved belief could be a weapon not just in battle, but in politics, finance, and propaganda too. And when they fell, it was their own faith in their so-called true heresy that justified their destruction. Their downfall is a cautionary tale. The Knights Templar became a symbol of unchecked power, answerable to no one, protected by the Pope, richer than kings. Their collapse exposed just how fragile institutions are, even ones wrapped in divine authority. This was medieval corporate overthrow, not by shareholders, but by the royal powers in Rome. Today, they feel more like legend than real people, but myths shape memory, and the story of the Knights Templar, brave, flawed, betrayed, reminds us history isn't just about victories. Sometimes it's about muddy streets and cathedrals rising tall, Like sermons in stone, Gothic style was just getting started. Remember, it was worn by guys who thought they were doing God's work until politics, ambition, and fear had other plans, and in that clash of steel, gold, and fire, their legend was born. In the 12th century, Paris was changing fast. Trade routes were expanding, universities popping up, and the church flexing more muscle than ever. It was an age of political, spiritual, and architectural ambition. Right in the heart of this growing city was a dream carved in stone, a dream owned by Maurice de Sully, Bishop of Paris, appointed in 1160. He wasn't just a man of God, he had vision. The current Saint-Étienne Cathedral was crumbling and frankly uninspiring. Paris was booming, and its religious center needed to match that swagger. So de Sully dreamed bigger, much bigger. He proposed building a cathedral so grand it would knock everyone's socks off, overshadowing everything around it. Not just a monument to the Virgin Mary, but a symbol of the Catholic Church's power and glory in France. This wouldn't be some Roman fortress-style building like before. Nope. It was going to be fresh, radical Gothic style. In 1163, that dream kicked off. Tradition says Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone in a blessing ceremony. Construction began on the east side, where the choir and chapels would be, where priests would sing hymns under soaring glass and stone vaults. But this wasn't your average construction project. It wasn't just a building. It was a commitment spanning generations. So the people of Paris, builders, blacksmiths, carpenters, artists got to work. They hauled limestone from nearby quarries, shaped it with medieval tools, and raised scaffolds that seemed to touch the sky. Every block placed by hand, every carving, every window, every rib of the vault crafted with patience, faith, and sweat. It took decades just to finish the first parts. The workers knew they'd never live to see the towers complete. Sons inherited chisels from fathers. Generations passed, and Notre Dame slowly rose, majestic on the Paris skyline. But for Bishop de Sully, the goal was crystal clear: build a house of God so grand and glorious that just stepping inside would humble your soul. Notre Dame was never just a church. It was worship, etched in stone, proof of what humanity can build when aimed at heaven. The first stone was just the beginning. What happened next would reshape the skyline and soul of medieval Europe. By the 1170s, Notre Dame was rising not just as architecture, but as a symbol. In a city of narrow wooden houses and muddy streets, the cathedral took shape, towering over the skyline like a sermon in stone. Gothic style, still in its infancy, was about to redefine what a church meant. Not just a place to pray, but a tool for awe. Construction moved east to west, starting with the choir where priests performed sacred rites, then to the nave, a vast open space for worshipers. The architecture was revolutionary. Walls thinner, ceilings higher, pointed arches carried more weight downward, along with ribbed vaults. They didn't just hold up the roof, they sang, guiding eyes and souls heavenward. But perhaps the most radical idea was light. Unlike the dim Romanesque churches of old, Notre Dame was built to shine, ready to redefine what a church even meant, not just a place to pray, but a tool of awe. Construction moved east to west, starting from the choir where priests performed sacred rituals, then to the nave, a huge open space for the faithful. The architecture was revolutionary. Thinner walls, soaring ceilings, pointed arches carried more weight downwards, along with ribbed vaults. They didn't just hold up the roof, they sang, lifting eyes and souls heavenward. But maybe the boldest idea was light. Unlike the dim Romanesque churches of old, Notre Dame was built to shine. Massive stained glass windows filtered colored light into sacred geometric patterns. Biblical scenes came alive with the sunrise. The church didn't just tell stories anymore, it enlightened. Every part of Notre Dame had meaning. The columns weren't just support beams, they were saints, enlightening stuff. Every part of Notre Dame means something. The pillars aren't just for support, they represent saints. The arched gateways aren't just decoration, they're pathways to salvation. The stone is theology, and the builders are the theologians in stone. Meanwhile, outside the city walls, Paris was changing. The cathedral became the city's heartbeat. Markets gathered around it. Sermons echoed through the streets. Students from the growing University of Paris flocked beneath its shadow. Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was becoming the soul of the city. Still, progress was slow. No cranes, no power tools, just muscle, wooden scaffolds, and endless grit. Hundreds of workers toiled year after year. When one died, another took his place. Their names rarely recorded. Their reward wasn't fame, it was faith. They built not for themselves, but for God and future generations. By 1200, the choir and most of the nave were standing firm. Sketches of a miracle were taking shape. Notre Dame was no longer a dream. It was stone and glass, sweat and prayer. And just like the building reached for the sky, so did the ambition of its builders. Because what came next would defy gravity and reason. Notre Dame was like nothing the city had ever seen before, but it was wildly ambitious. As walls rose and the ceiling stretched, a problem popped up. Weight. The stone ceiling pushed outwards, not just down. The higher it went, the more the vaults threatened to shove the walls apart. Traditional Romanesque churches solved this with thick walls and tiny windows, but Notre Dame was built to breathe, to shine, to spiritually and spatially reach heaven. That's when the Freemasons pulled a revolutionary stunt. They tried something bold, barely tested at the time, flying buttresses. These weren't just supports, they were stone arms on the outside, curving from upper walls down to sturdy walls standing apart from the main building, like bony wings. They held the church from outside, channeling the ceiling's force down to the ground where it couldn't do any damage. From the ground, they looked fragile, like limestone lace. But these guys were engineering geniuses, and they made Notre Dame the airy, light-filled, impossibly tall masterpiece it always dreamed of being. Flying buttresses changed everything. As the pressure on inside walls dropped, builders could add more windows, huge rose windows, massive stained glass wheels depicting saints, angels, And the apocalypse weren't just dreams anymore. They were real. Colors exploded in that holy space. And stories of God didn't just come from the pulpit, they came from sunlight itself. Ironically, the original plans for Notre Dame didn't include flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders hadn't quite grasped their potential, but as the structure grew, so did the pressure. The builders adapted fast, literally on the fly. They started adding these stone wings in the early 1200s, turning necessity into poetry. Critics at the time were split. Some thought these exposed supports looked ugly, ruining the cathedral's sleek look, but most were amazed. Notre Dame looked like it was held up by stone angels mid-flight. The cathedral wasn't just God's house anymore. It was a living proof that faith and math can build wonders together. A hymn carved in weightless limestone, with wings just beginning to spread. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had changed Paris's skyline, but its most iconic features were still forming. As the eastern part neared completion, attention turned west. What rose there would become the cathedral's face, the part most people would recognize first, the Twin Towers, and the massive western facade. This facade wasn't just an entrance, it was a spiritual. What grew there would become the church's face. The part most people recognize first, the Twin Towers, and the massive west facade. This wasn't just an entrance, it was a spiritual statement, architectural, political. The church wanted you to feel tiny as you approached, and oh, they nailed it. Doors soaring to ridiculous heights. Above, rows of statues, kings, prophets, saints, and demons watching every visitor. You weren't just walking into a building. You were stepping into divine judgment. The west towers started going up around the 1220s. Like everything at Notre Dame, they took decades to finish. Each tower rose bit by bit by bit, block by block, getting taller and taller until nearly hitting 230 feet. But they never really finished. As originally planned, no spires, no needles, just these massive, flat silhouettes standing proud in their stark simplicity. Between the two towers sat the Gallery of Kings, 28 statues representing the kings of Judah. Fun fact, during the French Revolution, people totally confused them for French kings and chopped their heads off in a tragic mess. But back in the 13th century, they sent a clear message: divine power, heavenly order, sacred rules. The church and the crown were hand in hand, and this was their front porch. Below them, 3 giant doors played the role of stone theology stories. The central door, the Last Judgment Gate, was carved with Christ sitting in glory, flanked by angels, demons, and souls rising from their graves. For the illiterate masses, these scenes weren't just decoration, they were sermons. The message was crystal clear: enter with reverence. Eternity starts here. Above the doorway, a rose window nearly 33 feet wide burst into bloom, framed by intricate designs and flanked by statues of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. Light streamed through the stained glass like spotlights on the saints down the nave. By the mid-1200s, the towers were almost done. The facade stood tall, solemn, symmetrical, and totally awe-inspiring. It was a fortress of faith, a billboard for God's power, and a warning to sinners. Yet the builders weren't done. Notre Dame's heart still needed finishing. The arches, the roof, the spire that would one day pierce the clouds. They'd built the face. Now they'd crown it, with the west towers and facade defying gravity. Notre Dame was turning into more than just a shell. It needed a soul, and that soul lived inside the vast space of the nave, the transepts, and the sacred choir. This was the place where monks' voices echoed, kings walked, and thousands prayed. By the mid-1200s, work focused on the transepts, those arms of the cross-shaped Gothic church layout, under architects Johann and later Pierre de Montreuil. These wings expanded and got decked out with new rose windows, even fancier than the western ones. The north portal had a bright window, bathing the space in cool blues and heavenly purples. The south side was warmer, louder, and just as stunning. These weren't just design choices. They were colorful theology. The north window represented the Old Testament, the south the New Testament. Together they told the full story of salvation, one side lit by light, the other by fire. Inside, the soaring columns looked like tree trunks in a stone forest. The vaulted ceiling soared nearly 115 feet high, with ribs stacked like two praying hands. This wasn't architecture. It was choreography, a movement upward, leading souls to heaven. And then there was the altar, the sacred heart of the space. Mass was celebrated here. Relics were honored here. And here, France's elite had to kneel. Royal weddings, coronations, papal visits. Notre Dame became the spiritual stage for the whole nation. But it wasn't just the upper crust filling these walls. Everyone came. Merchants, peasants, pilgrims. The cathedral became a public sanctuary, echoing sermons, songs, and sometimes a sharp rebuke from the pulpit. It was a place to witness miracles or beg for one. Every surface inside told a story: sculptures, stained glass, even the floor tiles. Notre Dame wasn't just a container of the sacred, it was the sacred itself. Faith was everywhere, carved in stone, hanging in the incense, shining from glass. By the late worn 13th century, the interior was nearly finished. The heart of the church beat strong, but it was still missing that thing was a crown piercing the sky. And that's when they started building the tower. By the late 1200s, Notre Dame looked like a miracle, towering spires, a nave echoing with hymns, and rose windows flooding the inside with holy light. But something was still missing. The cathedral had a face, a heart, and wings, but no crown, no vertical highlight to pull your eyes up from the roofline towards the heavens. That's when the plan to build the spire kicked off. Unlike the heavy, grounded twin towers, the spire would be elegant, a needle shooting straight up from the crossing at the church's center, built of oak and clad in lead. The original spire was both a technical nightmare and a spiritual statement. It wasn't just decoration. It was Notre Dame's exclamation point. its most visible prayer. Building it required skilled carpenters and metal workers. They used manpower, hoists, pulleys, and scaffolding to haul oak beams up. The structure had to be light, but sturdy enough to withstand the winds. Blowing in from Shanghai, yes. Long-distance gusts all the way to Paris. When finished, the spire pierced the sky like a sword raised in devotion, and below it, even more complex work was underway. Gargoyles, bizarre and ghostly creatures, emerged from the stone. They weren't just weird for fun. Many served as waterspouts to redirect rain off the building. Others were symbolic guardians, meant to ward off evil or remind sinners what awaited them. The final phase also included dozens of Chimera's hybrid beast statues perched high above Paris, eyes fixed on the horizon. They were nightmares and marvels rolled into one, part of Gothic love for mystery and symbolism. Inside the finished chapels, choir stalls were carved and relics carefully stored. Notre Dame was now fully operational, both a holy machine and a national stage. It took over a century of work, tens of thousands of laborers, and the faith of an entire kingdom. By 1345, nearly 200 years after the first stone was laid, the cathedral was considered complete, but complete was never really the right word. Notre Dame was never frozen in time. It would be restored, rebuilt, and renewed over centuries. But by the 14th century, this masterpiece was done. The Gothic era had built its masterpiece. By mid-14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was more than a church. It was a grand cathedral, a towering symbol of Catholic dominance, royal power, and national identity for the next 4 centuries. It wasn't just the heart of Paris, but the stage for France's grand dramas. It became this heart of state religion, hosting coronations, royal weddings, and solemn funerals. When kings married, they did so under the cathedral's vaults. When wars were declared or victories celebrated, Notre Dame's bells rang out across the city. Monarchs entered as rulers of the land and left as God's chosen. But it wasn't just kings walking. Through those massive doors, generals, bishops, and foreign dignitaries came to kneel or negotiate. And when disaster struck, famine, plagues, invasion, Parisians filled the nave with prayers and processions, desperately hoping for divine intervention. The cathedral became a refuge of hope and fear, always watching, always waiting, politically. Notre Dame became the spiritual pillar of the French monarchy, its prime spot on Ile de la Cité, right in the literal and symbolic center of Paris, made it the perfect backdrop for ceremonial power. Priests blessed flags before war. The crown wasn't just about royal blood, it was about divine mandate. If the king ruled France, Notre Dame ruled his soul. And, culturally, it remained the epicenter of awe. Pilgrims traveled miles just to glimpse its sacred relics, including the crown. The crown wasn't just about royal blood, it was divine mandate. If the king ruled France, Notre Dame ruled his soul and culturally remained the center of awe. Pilgrims traveled miles just to glimpse holy relics, including the crown, the thorns, said to be worn by Jesus himself. Its massive organ boomed out on festival days, the choir echoing polyphonic music that broke medieval boundaries. Notre Dame wasn't static. It grew, absorbing new art styles, musical traditions, and cultural forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, its Gothic glory started falling out of favor. Baroque architecture was in vogue, while Notre Dame dark, spiky, medieval was considered outdated. Some renovations tried to modernize its look, toning down the boldness. Still, it stood there, a church stuck in time, revered but increasingly forgotten. Those towers have weathered storms and centuries, bells still ringing, but something's changing beneath their foundations. Notre Dame was born from faith and crowned by kings, but soon it would face a force even stone couldn't ignore: the Revolution. When the French Revolution kicked off in 1789, Notre Dame found itself on the wrong side of history. For centuries, it stood as a monument to monarchy and religion, the two institutions the Revolution was out to erase. Suddenly, this church, once the coronation site of kings, became a symbol of oppression, and revolutionaries don't do symbols gently. This attack was both ideological and literal. The revolutionaries stormed the church. The statues of biblical kings decorating the facade were mistaken for French kings. All 28 heads got chopped off. The sculptures were smashed to bits. The altar was desecrated. The big bells that once rang for royal births and papal visits were destroyed and melted down to cast cannons. Precious relics like the crown of thorns were stolen and hidden away. Many were lost forever. What was left was an empty shell. Notre Dame was officially abolished in 1793. It wasn't a church anymore. Instead, it became the so-called Temple of Reason, repurposed for secular revolutionary festivals. At one point, it even served as a wine warehouse. The soaring nave, once echoing sacred hymns, now smelled of barrels and damp stone. The damaged, rotting spire was finally dismantled for safety. The stone gargoyles fell from their perches. The roof leaked. Rats scurried through the crypt. It was like Paris had lost its heart, just a forgotten pile of rubble in the middle of town. But it survived. When Napoleon came to power, he recognized Notre Dame's symbolic muscle. In 1804, he picked it as his self-coronation spot. The cathedral was reconsecrated and cleaned up just enough for a fancy ceremony. But this wasn't about religion. It was a show. Napoleon crowned himself, snatching the crown right out of the Pope's hands. Notre Dame was back serving the powerful, but without the sacred vibe it used to have. Still, decades of neglect left scars. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was crumbling, both physically and spiritually. Plans to tear it down popped up more than once. Some Parisians thought it'd be better replaced by something modern, less medieval, less spooky. And then a writer showed up. A writer who saw past the cracked stones and shattered statues to something eternal, something worth saving, because just as the world was about to forget Notre Dame, Victor Hugo reminded them. In 1831, a book hit the shelves that might just save a cathedral. Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, wasn't just a Gothic novel. It was a passionate plea for preservation. through the eyes of Quasimodo, the bell ringer. Hugo made Notre Dame more than a backdrop. It became a living, wounded, misunderstood character, beautiful in decay, and people listened. The novel tugged at hearts all over France. Suddenly, Parisians realized what they were about to lose. Notre Dame wasn't just old, it was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The backlash worked. By 1844, King Louis-Philippe approved a full restoration. The church, leading this revolution, were architects Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Their goal wasn't just to fix the damage, but to restore the cathedral's soul. They replaced eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and redesigned the spire destroyed in the Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viollet-le-Duc, stood 96 meters tall, taller and fancier than the original. It became one of Europe's most iconic symbols throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Dedication and craftsmanship through centuries. Opposition had its effect. By 1844, King Louis-Philippe approved a full restoration. Leading this revival were two architects, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Their goal wasn't just to fix damage, but to restore the cathedral's soul. They replaced eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and redesigned the spire destroyed during the French Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viollet-le-Duc, would soar 96 meters above ground, taller and fancier than the original. It became one of Europe's most iconic symbols throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Notre Dame reclaimed its spot as the cultural and spiritual heart of Paris. It hosted masses, witnessed liberation ceremonies, and welcomed millions of visitors. It survived 2 world wars. During Nazi occupation, the cathedral's bells fell silent. When Paris was finally freed in 1944, they cheered victory, but then tragedy struck. Again, on April 15th, 2019, a fire broke out under the roof. In just minutes, flames devoured the wooden framework known as the forest. Some beams dated back to the 13th century. The fire raged for hours. The roof collapsed. A 19th century spire fell in a cloud of smoke. The world watched in horror as one of humanity's greatest landmarks seemed to vanish in real time. But once again, it survived. The stone towers still stood tall. The rose windows remained intact. Artifacts were preserved, and the French people, along with the world, vowed to rebuild. Notre Dame has always meant more than just architecture. It's memory, identity, resilience, a church, a symbol, a survivor, and in every stone that rises again from the ashes. It reminds us that faith and beauty can be reborn. She was born in 1775 in Guangdong Province, China. Her birth name lost to history. She's only known as Yung Yi Sao, wife of Yung Yi. But what she did with that name shook an empire. In her youth, she was a prostitute in a notorious brothel in Guangdong, a common fate for poor girls on China's coast in the 18th century. These flower boats catered to merchants, naval officers, and pirates alike. But she wasn't like the others. She listened, she watched, she remembered names. She made powerful clients speak up. Over time, she became more than entertainment. She became an information broker. Then Jung Yi appeared, a fierce pirate captain commanding the Red Flag Fleet. One of the most feared pirate factions in the South China Sea. Not the first pirate she served, but definitely the last. Impressed by her smarts and savvy, Jung Yi proposed. She accepted no strings attached, in a move nearly unheard of at the time. She negotiated her position. She wanted co-control of the fleet, not just as a wife, but as a partner. She'd handle political alliances, manage loot, and have a say in every strategic move. Jung Yi agreed, whether out of love or street smarts. He knew she was a valuable asset. Their 1801 marriage kicked off, one of history's most successful pirate reigns. Jung Yi quickly dove into pirate politics. She studied the hierarchy, rivalries, and rules of the pirate world. While Jung Yi sailed and conquered, she quietly built networks, recruited allies, and learned to rule from the shadows. But she didn't stay in the shadows for long. When Jung Yi suddenly died in 1807, possibly in a storm, many thought his empire would crumble. Scores of pirate captains waited to strike, expecting a power vacuum. Instead, they got a power struggle as Jung Yao took command, not by force, but by strategy. She took over the Red Flag Fleet. She solidified alliances and married Jung Yi's adopted son and lieutenant, Chungpo Sai, securing both personal loyalty and military strength, from prostitute to pirate queen in less than a decade. And she was just getting started. When Jung Yao took command in 1807, she didn't just inherit a pirate fleet. She inherited a floating kingdom, but instead of letting it fall apart in chaos after her husband's death, she tightened her grip and made it stronger under her reign. The Red Flag Fleet not only survived but thrived. The South China Sea had long been plagued by pirates, but what Jung Yi Sao commanded was without precedent. She oversaw a fleet of over 300 ships, which grew to more than 600 within a year. Some estimates say she eventually commanded over 1,800 ships with up to 70,000 crew under her, more than the navies of several European powers combined back then. She did this with ruthless pragmatism and a deep understanding of pirate psychology. She held power not just by muscle, but by creating a system that tied captains to her. She established a strict code to govern every part of pirate life plunder: loyalty, discipline, and punishment. Disobedience meant brutal consequences. Anyone caught stealing from the communal fund lost their head. If a pirate attacked a female prisoner without permission, execution was the sentence. If a pirate ran away, his ear was cut off and he was paraded before the fleet as a warning. But it wasn't just fear. Jung Yi Sao offered protection, structure, and profit. Her code let pirates keep a fair 20% of loot, while the rest went into a communal fund she controlled. This gave everyone a stake in the system and built loyalty through stability. Even defeated rivals and coastal villagers, usually chose to join her side rather than fight back. She divided her massive fleet into 6 squadrons, each with its own color red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. But ultimately, they all reported to her. Her closest ally and second in command, Chungpo Sai, led the Red Squadron, her elite force. Under Jung Yi-sao, piracy turned into its own government, complete with taxes, defense, and a hierarchy. She ruled sea routes from Vietnam to Hong Kong, controlled trade, attacked empire outposts, and even collected tribute from coastal towns. The Qing had a navy, Jung Yi-sao had an empire, and it kept growing. Jung Yi-sao ruled not just with brute force, but with ironclad rules, while pirates usually scream chaos and drunkenness. Her fleet ran more like a disciplined corporation than a rogue gang. And at the heart of this structure was her pirate code, a detailed system turning chaos into method. This wasn't some romantic parchment passed around by candlelight. It was brutal, binding, and enforced without mercy. Every captain and crew member knew the drill. Break the rules, and you faced humiliation at best, execution at worst. One of the most infamous rules was the loot division. After every raid, all the loot had to go to the fleet's central warehouse. The pirate in charge got a 20% cut, while the rest went into the common fund. That fund, managed by Jung Yi-sao and her officers, paid for fleet maintenance, widows' pensions, bribes, and emergency funds. Stealing from the collective wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you killed. Then came discipline. Disobeying orders in battle was a serious crime. Cowards who abandoned their squadron or disobeyed orders could be whipped, executed, or thrown overboard. Desertion, immediate beheading. The code even covered relationships. If a pirate kidnapped a woman, he had to treat her with respect. Sexual assault meant execution by beheading. She didn't care about chaos. She cared about control. And her code gave her exactly that. It created a reliable system where pirates knew the rules, the consequences, and their cut. It bound loyalty not just to Jung Yi-sao as a leader, but to the system she represented. Believe it or not, she'd let prisoners and coastal civilians join her forces. In return, they swore loyalty to her code. Many did. Some joined out of fear, others out of admiration. Some just realized life under Jung Yi-sao was safer, more profitable, and fairer than under the corrupt Qing regime. Her rules weren't just shipboard. Coastal villages under her protection had to pay tribute for safety and autonomy. Resistors got burned to the ground. Compliers became part of her growing empire. She wasn't just a pirate. She was a queen, and her code was the law. By 1808, Jung Yi-sao's pirate empire wasn't just a nuisance at sea anymore. It was a national threat. Her fleet dominated the South China Sea, disrupting trade routes and attacking coastal towns with impunity. The Qing, embarrassed and overwhelmed, had to act, but they weren't ready for what was coming. The Imperial Navy launched a campaign to wipe out the pirates, sending warships after Jung Yi-sao's fleet. What happened next wasn't a quick string of victories, but a masterclass in imperial incompetence, time and again. The Navy was outmaneuvered by Zheng Yisao's forces in tactics, firepower, and sheer skill. She knew these waters better than anyone. She used weather patterns, islands, and shallow tides to trap the heavier Qing ships. Her sailors fought as using weather patterns, islands, and shallow tides to trap the heavier Qing ships. Sailors fought in coordinated units, switching ships mid-battle and luring enemies into ambushes with terrifying precision. Not just once, entire Qing fleets were captured, their ships absorbed into the Red Flag Navy, and mentally. The difference was staggering. While imperial officials were often corrupt, underpaid, or cowardly, Zheng Yisao's soldiers were well organized and fiercely loyal, following her rules and rewarded for victories. As battles dragged on, the Qing dynasty's desperation became crystal clear. They called in European heavy hitters like Portugal and Britain to help out at sea. These foreign navies had better ships and firepower, but they didn't have Zheng Yisao's local know-how or the united purpose of her fleet. Still, the pressure kept mounting. By 1809, the Qing, Portuguese, and Guangdong forces had surrounded part of her fleet. But even then, she fought back, pulled strategic retreats, and launched counterattacks that left her enemies dazed. She didn't just survive, she humiliated an empire. But war is expensive. Long conflicts drain resources and wear people down. Even a pirate empire can't fight forever. And while she stayed undefeated at sea, Zheng Yisao figured out something crucial. Sometimes winning every battle isn't the point. Sometimes it's about knowing when to walk away with everything still intact. She wasn't planning to die at sea or be dragged in chains to the Qing court. She had a different plan, one that even her enemies wouldn't see coming. By 1810, Zheng Yisao had done these impossible. She stopped the Qing dynasty's power, humiliated foreign navies, and ruled the waves with unmatched dominance. But she was also a realist. She knew war, especially endless battlefields and growing enemies, can't last forever. Supplies were running low, alliances were strained, and her fleet, though still mighty, was feeling the weight of attrition, so she switched tactics. Zheng Yisao approached the Qing government not to surrender, but to lay down bold terms. She knew she had the upper hand. The Qing couldn't beat her militarily. Their people feared her more than they respected the empire. She could negotiate, not like a criminal begging for mercy, but like a leader of a nation. She personally sailed to Guangzhou on her ship, guarded by armed troops, the fleet's red flag flying proudly. This wasn't a plea, it was a power move. She demanded amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire fleet, thousands of pirates. She insisted on keeping her loot. She even insisted her second-in-command, Zheng Puai, get a military rank in the Qing Navy. The government was stunned, but truth be told, they were tired too. The empire couldn't handle another costly campaign. So, in a rare moment of common sense, they agreed. Zheng Yisao surrendered with style. On April 18th, 1810, She led over 17,000 pirates' men, women, and kids into the city, not in chains, but in a parade. More than 200 ships were handed over, weapons ceremoniously laid down, and the entire pirate alliance disbanded without a drop of bloodshed. No trials, no executions, no confiscations. Chung Poi was made a captain in the Qing Navy. Zhong Yi Sao retired a free woman, unscathed, undefeated, and still incredibly wealthy, in a world where most pirate stories end in betrayal or death. Zhong Yi Sao's ended with negotiation and retirement. She played the game perfectly, first with cannons, then with words, and when her red flag was lowered, her legend was just beginning to rise. Most pirate tales end with blood, hangings, or oblivion. But Jung Yi-so dodged that fate. She built a second life from it after negotiating the largest pirate surrender in history. In history, she left not as a fugitive, but as a wealthy, respected woman with her legacy intact. It's 1810. After her fleet surrendered, she settled in Guangzhou, now Guangha, with her husband, Chong Pui, who was then a Qing Navy captain. The switch from pirate queen to respected citizen might seem absurd, but for Jung Yao, it was just smart survival. She lived openly, even comfortably, and the Qing government mostly left her alone. Instead of fading into obscurity, she quietly became a businesswoman. She ran a casino and a technically illegal opium smuggling operation, but thanks to her influence, authorities mostly turned a blind eye. She wasn't building a new empire, but she sure wasn't about to be forgotten either. She kept her connections tight, protected her assets, and lived life on her own terms. Her marriage to Chung Pui stayed strong, and together they built a family. While he kept hunting pirates who were basically just reflections of their own past, Jung Yao focused on their business interests. She mingled with the elite, advised on maritime matters, and remained a legend among sailors and merchants all along the South China coast. What's truly amazing isn't just that she survived, but how she lived. She shattered every mold society had for women born poor, sold into prostitution. She clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated criminal world. Then, instead of dying in battle or on the gallows, she retired peacefully and passed away in 1844 at the ripe old age of 69. She wasn't looking for redemption. Nope, she didn't need it. Her life was the ultimate middle finger to every law, custom, and expectation thrown her way. In a time when women barely spoke in public, Jung Yao commanded fleets, brokered treaties, and negotiated with emperors. Then she walked away richer and freer than any pirate in history. The sails came down, the cannons fell silent, but her legend echoes across the seas. History remembers pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who roamed the Caribbean, sowed chaos, and met violent ends. But in the shadow of that fame, Jung Yi-sao appears not just on par with them, but outshining them in almost every way. She wasn't captain of a few ships. She commanded an entire fleet. She didn't just raid some coastal towns, she controlled whole seas. And she didn't die on a hangman's noose or in a gunfight. She negotiated her way out of piracy and found peace. Among all this pirate legends, she remains the most successful and the most misunderstood, but don't get it twisted. Her success wasn't luck or brutality. It was strategy, brains, and a deep understanding of power. She was a tactician, a politician, and a psychologist. She knew how to keep loyalty through fear sure but also order, rewards, and a carefully built system. What really made her special was that she pulled all this off as a woman in Qing Dynasty China, a society soaked in chaotic ideals that demanded women be silent and obedient. Women weren't expected to lead markets, let alone rule the seas. Gyung Yi-so didn't just challenge that norm, she shattered it. She earned the respect of seasoned pirate captains, forced the Qing dynasty to the negotiating table, and ended her life as a businesswoman and a mother. She didn't rely on a man's legacy. She took it, expanded it, and made it her own. In people's memories, she's still a ghost, less famous than her male counterparts, less romanticized in Western literature, and often ignored by mainstream history, but in Chinese maritime circles and coastal legends, she's spoken of with reverence. The Red Flag Fleet may have vanished, the sails lowered forever, but the memory of Yo remains like a ghost ship, silent, untouchable, and bigger than truth. Not just a pirate, not just a woman, but a legend who made empires bow. And in a man's world, she never asked for a seat at the table. She took the whole. Legend who made empires bow. And in a man's world, she never asked for a seat at the table. She took over the entire ocean, despite commanding the largest pirate fleet ever seen. Zhong Yao is oddly absent from most mainstream history books. Her massive legacy has been overshadowed, eclipsed by Western pirate myths, and buried under layers of colonial bias, gender prejudice, and political turmoil. Why? Because her story doesn't fit the usual mold. She wasn't a tragic anti-hero like Blackbeard. She wasn't a son, die in battle. She wasn't European. And the scariest part, she was a woman who took down an entire empire. That kind of power totally wrecks the neat storytelling historians have obsessed over for ages. In official Chinese records, she's more of a problem solved than a fascinating figure worth studying. The Qing dynasty didn't want to celebrate her. They wanted to forget her. After all, she exposed the Navy's weak spots, challenged imperial power, and escaped punishment. Even when successful, she was an embarrassment to the throne. Western historians weren't any better. For centuries, pirates were romanticized through a European lens. Peg legs, rum, parrots, and loot. Yong Yao didn't fit that image. She wasn't some reckless thrill seeker. She was strategic, not fighting for glory. She negotiated her way to power. She wasn't killed by the state. She bargained with it and won. And for many historians, that's just not interesting. It's inconvenient. But in recent decades, her legend has made a comeback. Scholars, feminist historians, and pirate enthusiasts have started reclaiming her memory, giving her back her spot in the global story of naval power, documentaries, Historical novels, even video games have begun, recognizing the queen of the South China Sea, and to this day, much of her life remains a mystery. Her real name is lost. Most of what we know comes filtered through enemies, Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later European observers. But what we do know is enough to sketch the silhouette of a giant. She wasn't just a woman breaking molds. She was a woman who never cared about fitting in. Yong Yao didn't ask the world for permission to be powerful. She held power, used it precisely, and vanished into history with more wealth, power, and dignity than any pirate man or woman before or since. She didn't fade away. She was erased, but legends, as usual, found its way back. Zhong Yao didn't wear a crown. She didn't need to. Her power didn't come from a throne or royal bloodline. It came from orders, respect, fear, and thousands of voices shouting her commands over the waves. Literally, she was a queen, a king of a kingdom with no borders, no flag, and no fixed territory. Her territory was the South China Sea, stretching from the Gulf of Tonkin to the Guangdong coast. She built something no one had before or since. Her pirate alliance wasn't just crime, it was political, organized, and functional. She controlled trade routes, set laws, negotiated treaties, and enforced order across a region even the Qing Empire struggled to govern. Her ships weren't scattered raiders. They were fleets. Her captains weren't freelancers. They were officers. Her people weren't thugs. They were citizens of a floating nation. Yet what makes her legacy truly unmatched isn't just her rise, but her exit. Most pirate stories end in fire and ropes. Yong Yao's ended with negotiation, retirement, and wealth. She didn't go down with her ship. She walked away unscathed, undefeated, and clutching her wallet tight. When she died, in 1844, she did what no pirate, emperor, or general had done before. She chose to give up absolute power and keep her legend intact. Today, there are few monuments named after her, no palaces, no statues in squares, but her presence haunts the South China Sea like a dark cloud that never lifts, in sailors' whispers, in the ink of rebellious women, in the hearts of those who understand leadership isn't inheritance but willpower. Yong Yao proves greatness doesn't need permission, even in a world built to silence women. A sharp, strategic, and steadfast voice can always be heard. She commanded an entire empire. She made rulings without saying sorry. She fought without a second thought, and she retired without ever losing. Not too shabby, not a legend, not a myth. Just a woman who conquered the seas and walked away before the ocean could swallow her whole. The sails are gone, but their shadow still stretches over the waves.